look forward to working with you as we've worked for so many years on both financial services and foreign affairs. I look forward to the two hearings today, which are to some extent overlapping in their subject matter. I want to thank the following Democratic members for serving on this subcommittee. We have the gentleman from New York who's chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee and is in another room that I may have to run to, Mr. Meeks. We have Mr. Scott from Georgia, who is the ranking member on agriculture. We have Mr. Vargas from the great state of California, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez, and the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kasten, who was our subcommittee vice chair last Congress, and the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is the ranking member on the Housing and Insurance Subcommittee. All of those are returning from last Congress. We also have Mr. Lynch, who served on this subcommittee previously, and Mr. Wiley Nickel, who's the only complete freshman who is joining us, and I'm sure he'll be here soon. The titles of the hearings that we're holding today imply that every investor protection is a barrier, and it is. It's a barrier to what might be a great investment. It's a barrier to what might be fraud or an ill-suited investment or just a bad deal. The fact is we need the right blend of investor protection and securities regulation on the one hand and access to capital and access to investments on the other. We should not always be saying that we go in one direction or the other. The proof that securities regulation is actually helpful to those trying to raise capital is illustrated by the fact that all over the world, people send their money to be invested in countries that have good securities protection, whether that be London, whether that be New York, whether that may be elsewhere. In the presence of good investor protection, you get more capital invested in the markets. So investor protection not only protects investors, it's necessary for the business economy as a whole that is seeking investment. As to the topic of this hearing today, which focuses on the definition of accredited investor, found in Regulation D and elsewhere, I'm not here to defend it. We need a definition of a private placement that makes sense. And that doesn't mean it should be more restrictive or less restrictive that we have now, but it should be different. The chairwoman focuses on the sophisticated investor or accredited investor definition and points out that if you win the lottery on Monday, that doesn't make you an investment genius on Tuesday just because you have $1 million in the bank. Furthermore, the definition of $1 million, that's a 1982 definition. So it was either wrong then or it's wrong now, but it's a completely different amount of money. And very few people are saying, well, just index that for inflation and you got a great regulation, because the fact, as the chairwoman points out, is just because you're rich does not mean that you're in a good position to evaluate investments. But what we could do is change the definition of accredited investor to the following standards. Someone who's investing less than 5% of their net worth in a particular investment, and someone who either by their virtue of their own licenses and standards is a sophisticated investor, or someone whose advisor is sophisticated, but that advisor needs to be a fiduciary, truly independent, not receiving a commission, and not expecting to get referred business from the promoter. Because you can have an advisor who's sophisticated as hell. They are sophisticated in knowing who's paying their fee and who's referring the next client. And if that's the promoter, I would rather have a dumb investment advisor who was loyal to me than a smart one who was loyal to someone else. I want to thank the gentlelady for holding this hearing and make history in this subcommittee by yielding back almost 40 seconds.
Wow. Well done to the ranking member. That's a first, see?
Everyone in the audience should know you will get to hear from Mr. Kasten soon. That will be very interesting. Professor Fletcher is right in the extent that obviously the best investor protection is when you have the liquidity of the publicly registered company. You get audited financial statements. The statements not only good, not just an audit, but also a PCAOB review and an audit of the internal control system. The only problem with that is that it's millions of dollars to provide all that. And that doesn't count the millions of dollars that are then spent by the investment analyst industry. If you want to buy Apple or Disney, you're sitting on top of an information system, an information checking system that involves hundreds of millions of dollars, together with all of the analysts on Wall Street. Now, one could talk and say, well, let's close off the private markets to everything other than big companies. The private markets are much bigger than someone who focuses on securities regulation would realize, because we used to like, oh, you're doing a Regulation D, and there are 15 people in the room, or 300 people, and they're all getting stock certificates. Every pizzeria is a guy with a brother-in-law who put up money for every 4-unit apartment building is a couple of dentists. And there are a lot more pizzerias and apartment buildings than there are these offerings that we tend to focus on here. So we need a system where we determine, at least the pizzerias and the apartment buildings, et cetera, are going to be illiquid. They're not going to be audited financial statements, et cetera, and people are able to make their investments. Are we going to then allow that to be in private companies? As long as we have a Regulation D that focuses on wealth, it's very hard to justify that we don't index that for inflation. If Ronald Reagan's people were right that it should be $1 million then it should be $3.5 million now. But many of our witnesses have said that wealth shouldn't be a barrier. It seems unfair and it seems illogical. So the focus here is on sophistication of either the investor, well, it's unfair to say that you can't invest if you don't have an MBA, or the investment advisor who's truly independent. Mr. Alicia, you're no sucker. We've established that. But what standards should we have? I mean, do we include all the CPAs and attorneys? What about CFP? Should there be a separate? And we're licensing somebody to advise on everything from a soup company to a nut company. So is there any particular standard for what is a sophisticated investor?
Sure. Thank you, Ranking Member.
Or sophisticated advisor.
Thank you, Ranking Member Sherman. I think there's a couple of things that were mentioned, a lot of them recommendations from the Angel Capital Association. One, I think the licenses were a great start, but also education, right? We have MBAs out there. You can have, I had an MBA and I still wasn't accredited. I had all the knowledge from a leading university, so education.
I'm not sure Larry Summers would qualify.
I disagree.
Well, I mean, under the standards we have now. That's not a dig at Summers, that's a dig at the standards.
Understand. I think examinations are another one, and that could be done through the Angel Capital Association. Self-certifications.
And should we have different standards for whether you're a sophisticated investor or whether you're an advisor capable of making somebody else qualify?
The advisor side is something new, and I'm not, that one, there'd probably need a lot of safeguards around that one. You touched on some in your remarks.
You certainly need independent safeguards.
Correct.
And I realize it's not enough to have a fiduciary standard. You also have to have no commissions and no referrals. So it's got to be my person who's advising me, not the promoter's person who's advising me and then gets a referral and advises the next investor and the next investor.
How do you police that as well? Would be
well, with all of these, if you violate Regulation D, you have an illegal offering. You're liable for whatever people lose in the investment, et cetera. Plus, I think there are criminal penalties. And then finally, is there anybody here who thinks that anybody should be allowed, assuming they don't own the company, but or work in the company every day, but if you're an outside investor, should be able to invest more than 10% of their net worth in one of these? Raise your hands if you think that we allow more than 10% of the net worth from the investor. We see one hand.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Next, I'd like to recognize